Hey guys, welcome to Programming Knowledge. In the previous video, we saw how to do file operations in binary files using C++. You can also call it CRUD operations. So we saw that by taking an example of an employee class, right? So that class had an ID attribute which we used to identify each employee uniquely, and we were performing our operations on that. So the problem is that in that particular program, the ID was not being generated automatically. It was unique because I kept it unique, right? When we were writing the program, we had to keep it unique so that there were no conflicts in that program. But what happens is that generally you don't want to do it on a very large scale because you may forget what was the last ID or you may forget something else, right? So it's best that these kinds of things be automated. And how do we automate that thing? Well, you can use a global variable, that's a solution, but the best solution is to maintain something known as a static variable, and that's what we'll be talking about now. So well, static variable is nothing but that variable gets created and will stay until the program's life cycle ends. So what do I mean by that? Let's say I have a function here. So this is some function and I have say three variables inside this, and I even have some other variables. So let's say DE over here. Now what happens is that this main function is going to run indefinitely, right? So I'll be creating these two variables on start of this program, and let's say I even have some global variables. So let's say G and H are global variables, right? So let's say these two are the global variables. These three are the uh, function variables of this particular function called func, and this two are the variables which are there inside the main function. Now what happens is that once I run this program, first these two variables will be created, and then because main will run indefinitely, these two will also be created. And since I did not call this function, these variables won't be created, right? So now there's sometimes we do need variables to be created and stay even after their role ends. Or let's say we want a variable which acts like a global variable, but it is not a global variable because it's not useful anywhere else. So this kinds of requirements generally arises when you're using recursive functions. So let's say I create a function for calculating sum of numbers from 1 to n, which calculates it recursively. So let's quickly make a definition for that. So max, um, well, we'll just take the maximum element of an array. It's not sum of n numbers. Let's say the maximum element of an array. So you could just say max element, which takes an array and it takes an index so that it can recursively do that, right? Recursively calculate the maximum element which is present inside the array. So now what happens is that let's say I maintain a variable called max. Well, max is a keyword, so let's say underscore max, which is basically in the beginning it's int min. So if you do int min, you're basically getting the least value an integer can hold. So sorry, minus int min is same as int max. You will do either way. Sorry for confusing you on that, but basically int max and int min are the extremes you can store inside an integer, right? So now I get this maximum element, and now let's say I recursively find out the maximum element inside this array by using this index. Now what happens is that I don't want to create this maximum element again and again. So one solution is to keep a global maximum element. So I could just do int max over here, and I could start out with this. Well, I could just start out with this over here. So I could just say int max, and every time this function recurses, I can just update this maximum element so that I can get this maximum element inside this array. Well, it's not going to be int max technically, it's going to be int min because I'm taking the maximum element. If you are taking the minimum element, it should have been int max, right? So what, anyway, well, we are going to just follow this logic, but the problem here is that this max is actually accessible by any function and any class which is inside this program, right? And we don't want that because we're not going to use max anywhere else except this function. So the solution for such kinds of problem is to use something known as static variables, and that's what we're going to discuss today. So let me just quickly clean this. So using namespace standard int main, right? So the way we use static variables inside functions are like this. So you say int maximum element of an array and you pass in an index, and then instead of declaring it as int you just say static int max and it's going to be the minimum value, right? So now what happens is that if this max has not been initialized, it will be initialized with this int min, which is the minimum value an integer can hold, and then subsequently it will be updated. Well, the same variable will be updated even if it recurs through the function. So let's say we'll just quickly write this function. So what's the base case? Base case is when index equal to 0, right? So when index equal to 0, you just update max. So max becomes, well, we can just use a ternary operator here. So array of 0 is greater than the current max. Then max becomes array of 0, else it just stays, right? And then you just return the maximum. And then since this is the base case, or else what you do is you just do the same operation with the current index. So max equal to the array of let's say index minus 1. Well, I took 0 over here, so I'll be starting with the last index, right? So index n or n minus 1, right? So array of index is greater than the max. Then you just say array of index or else the max. And then what to do is you recurse through the same function. So max element of the same array but the index minus 1. And in the end you just return the maximum element. So this function is quite clear as a recursive function. The only difference being that instead of declaring this max as a global variable, you have declared it kind of inside the function, but the variable will be created in the global scope, but we cannot access it. We can only access it inside this function. Now if you just want to test this out, you can just create an array. You can just call it 1 2 3 4 5, and then well, this is quite obvious. Let's say 40 10 over here, and then you could just say max element of this array and start with index 4, or well, you can just take out the size from here, but since I mentioned index, it's just the last index, right? I'm going backwards. So if I do this, run this particular program, I'll be getting the maximum element as 10, which is correct one. So that's how we use static variables. The main thing is that we don't want to create it as global. That is because we don't want this variable to be accessed by everything. But at the same time, it should act like a global. It should not change, right? So if I just remove the static, well, the result is quite obvious because every time this function recurses, you'll be creating a new max, right? So if I just run this, you'll see that I've been creating a new max every time, and once I reach 5, max is basically the fifth element. That's because this at the last iteration what happens is that I'm just reassigning max to int min, so 5 is basically the maximum element possible, right? So that is something which we don't want. We want to store the maximum of the previous array elements also. So in that cases, you just need to make it as static and use it. Well, static variables inside functions are not really exciting. We generally use static in case of classes. And that's because we don't have to create an object of a class, or we don't have to create an instance of a class to use those static members or member functions. So let's quickly see how to do that. Let's take the case of the employee, right? So let's put everything as public for now, right? So now what we're going to do here is I'm going to say static int id, and I cannot actually assign it over here. I'll be getting an error. So if I try to do that, so let's say employee a, right? If I try to run that, I'll be getting an error. That's because I cannot uh, initialize a static member right inside the definition of a class. I need to do it outside. So how do I do that? I just need to do something like int employee id equal to whatever id you want to start with. So let's say I want to start with 1, right? Or you can just start with 0, and in the constructor you can increment this id. So we'll create the id, we'll keep the id private so that you don't get into issues. Or well, it doesn't really matter, right? You can keep it anywhere. So for this demonstration I'll just keep it private, because we are just going to have this id as static and no other members for this example, right? So you can just play around with this, but basically the concept remains the same. It's a global variable but not completely global. It's just it acts like a global variable but only for that scope, right? So now you have the static id. Well, it's static int id, and then in the public section I'm just going to define a constructor employee, right, which will auto increment this id. So that's what we wanted, right? We don't want to set the id again and again. So I just say id plus plus, right? And I can also keep a public variable which is going to be the id, right? Id of this current instance. So I could just say int emp id. Now what's the difference between these two things? This is basically a global id which will keep incrementing itself, but this is going to be the id of my employee which is using, like, basically the particular instance which we are targeting. So there I can just do employee id equal to the id which we incremented. So that actually s- solves our problem of having to manually increment these ids, right? And we also have initialize the static variable. Now what I can do is I could just create a b c d, and if I do let's say b dot employee id, right? And let's say d dot employee id. Now if I run this, I get 2 and 4, but I do not assign any employee IDs over there, right? So basically I auto incremented the IDs. Now every employee I create will be uniquely identified, and if you want to see how many employees I created, you can just access this variable, right? Since this is private, I would have kept it public. Well, generally we don't keep such things as public. We don't want to give it access, right? So well, you can just do a small function, so get count, right? And get count is basically going to return you the id. So it's going to be void, or I could just return that. So int get count, which is basically return the id. And I could just say cout get count, sorry, I could just say a dot get count, right? And I'll just keep a new line here for separation. And if I run this, I'll be getting 2, 4 and 4. That's basically the 4 employees we created, right? If I create another one, I'll be getting 5 there. So if I just say a b c d e, and well, I need to stop this, run it again. So here you can see 2, 4 and 5, which is basically the number of employees, but this isn't very intuitive, right? You're just saying a dot get count. A dot get count doesn't mean anything. Get count is basically for the employee class, not for the object, not for a particularly, right? So the way we can do that is we can also make this function as static. So how do we do that? We just say static int get count, and now what you can do here is, instead of accessing it through a, you can just do employee and then the scope resolution operator and get count. Now, what this means is that how many employee objects have I created? Just get me the count of that. And this is more intuitive than actually calling get count like that, right? So generally, whenever we want to use static variables, or whenever we want to view static variables, you generally put it as static functions, because they belong to the class, not the function. Sorry, not the instance, right? So if you see, get count is actually a function which belongs to employee class, not to A or not to B or not to D particularly. So now if I run this, I'll be getting the same output. So 2, 4 and number of employees I have created is 5, and you could use it in the other way if you wanted to. So I could just say, let's say b.getCount. So this will also work, right? You could access static variables directly, but this is not generally recommended as this is not very intuitive, right? So that's about static variables. In the next video, we'll do something exciting. We'll talk about generics, right? We'll talk about templates and how we can make generic functions so that we don't have to override them again and again. So if you remember about the vector, right? So if I do hash include vector, and here if I do something like vector, and then I need to put int over here. So this kind of thing, that's basically because I have only one vector class, but I can use it for any data type I want. So if I wanted for string, I could just do string over here. So we'll see how to do this thing for our own class, and that's all for this video. So in the next video, we'll see how to do all these things, and it's going to be really exciting from now on, right? So yeah, that's all for this video. Thanks for watching. Happy coding.